Nonviolent Atonement, our live chat with Andrew McKenna. I am Suzanne Ross, and my colleague in Oregon is...
Hi, I'm Adam Erickson. Coming to you from Eugene, Oregon. It's very nice here, nice and sunny. So, yeah, glad to be here and with you.
Yeah, it's our first chat where you and I are in different geographic locations, Adam, and our guest is with us.
Well, I'll remind you that it's our second chat because we did one with James Allison a couple of weeks ago, and that went really well.
Were you in Oregon then?
I was, yes.
Oh, my
I was coming to you from my in-laws' kitchen.
Oh, yes, of course. Okay.
Because my home office was not ready to go.
Okay, that's right. We'll call that a brain burp on my part.
Okay. That sounds very good.
That sounds very good. So let's just welcome everybody to our chat. This is Teaching Nonviolent Atonement, where we use mimetic theory to upend violent theories of salvation and atonement. Mimetic theory is an anthropology of human violence. And what it shows us is that the violence at the cross and in the Bible can be explained in human terms. So we think if you look at the cross and see evidence of God's violence there, you've got things backwards. The point of the cross is that interesting metaphor, is that it is humans who have habitually scapegoated victims in order to create and maintain peace. That is what we call violent atonement or reconciliation of a community through violence. It's what humans do.
So we call our site Teaching Nonviolent Atonement because we believe that scriptures reveal a God who reconciles humanity through enduring our violence, even unto death. Rather than inflict divine violence on his Son, God suffers our violence and forgives us for it. So each week or each time we have these chats, we work out the implications of this shift in atonement thinking with theologians and practitioners. And we are fortunate today to have with us our very good friend, Dr. Andrew McKenna. Andrew, thank you for being with us today.
My pleasure.
Awesome. So we have Andrew here to talk with us about a recent book that was published by Michigan State Press, Studies in Violence and Mimesis, called A Refuge of Lies by Cesareo Bandera. And the subtitle is Reflections on Faith and Fiction. And Andrew wrote a great book review about A Refuge of Lies for the bulletin of cover. And Suzanne, do you have that bulletin available right there? You can throw up.
No, I only printed out Andrew's review of it. It's online.
I only did too. You can find it online on Cover's website. I'll also link to it below when we post up the video. But Andrew is professor of French language and literature at Loyola University in Chicago, and Andrew was one of Renee Girard's first students. Andrew is the author of the book Violence and Difference, Renee Girard, Derrida, and Deconstruction. And Andrew is also the author of many articles on mimetic theory, including the title that we just discussed, on A Refuge of Lies. You can find that review on the cover bulletin. And so, Andrew, thanks again for being with us. This is our second attempt at this, and I'm hoping that the recording will come through better this time. So thank you for being with us again.
Quite welcome. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, we are thrilled to talk with you, Andrew, about Cesareo's book. You and Cesareo have a long relationship.
Yes.
You go way back, right?
Way back, several decades. I met him at the early cover meetings at the present at the creation, creating this research forum for mimetic theory, and I was very early aware that he gets it. This is a foundational understanding of mimetic theory, and of course he brings it to Spanish literature. There were no mimetic Hispanists or Hispanic mimeticians at that time, and I have reviewed, I believe, his last 3 books in the bulletin.
Yeah.
So I'm supposed to know what I'm talking about.
I know. Well, and Cesareo's work on Cervantes' Don Quixote was very influential to Rene, or vice versa. They seem to influence one another there.
No, where that's concerned, it's very interesting. The foundational text for Rene's idea of mimetic desire is Don Quixote. Okay. And there's an interview in which he's sitting there holding a Don Quixote in his lap, and he said, when I read this novel, I knew the Don was mad. Everybody else saying, the Don is great, he's tilting at windmills, isn't that cool, etc. And no, that is his. I was talking about Dostoevsky, but Don Quixote is his foundational text. Yeah. A quote from that novel is the first thing you see on his first big book called Deceit, Desire in the novel. And that becomes his pathway into reading mimetic desire. That is to say, finding how novelists the great novelists are reading mimetic desire as it works out among us. Yeah.
Right. So then where does Cesareo's work fit in?
Well, Cesareo was Rene went from Johns Hopkins to State University of Buffalo, State University of New York in Buffalo, and they attracted Rene from Johns Hopkins, and they attracted Cesareo from Cornell, and so they became colleagues.
Oh.
And in A Refuge of Lies, Cesareo doesn't go into, let's say, that backstory, that history, but that's where they met, and they fed each other. Rene at that time was writing Violence and the Sacred, and Cesareo came out of that exchange with a book called Mimesis Conflictiva, which is about Calderón, Lope de Vega, and Cervantes, and since then, his books, a number of them have been published both in Spanish and in English. But so their collaboration has endured, several decades.
Let's say decades.
Yes.
Yeah.
At my age, I don't want to actually do any more counting.
No.
It's generality.
That's perfectly specific enough. But I thought we could begin talking about Cesareo's wonderful book by looking at the title, A Refuge of Lies, and where he gets that expression from, which is this wonderful passage in Isaiah chapter 28, where the prophet says that, therefore hear the word of the Lord, you scoffers who rule this people in Jerusalem, because you have said, we have made a covenant with death. They're kind of bragging about it, right?
Yes.
We have made a covenant with death, with Sheol. We have an agreement. When the overwhelming scourge passes through, it will not come to us.
Right.
They'll be protected. So can you talk a little bit about this? What is this scourge they're being protected from, and how does this we have made a refuge of lies. We have made lies our refuge.
Made lies our refuge. It is a very dense passage, and I want to say at the start that one of the supreme virtues of Cesareo's book is that he opens up these kinds of passages to anthropological understanding and explanation. And there, the covenant, you have made a covenant of death. Does that mean people sat around a fire and said, let's make a covenant of death? No. Isaiah is making it explicit what is implicit in the idolatrous and sacrificial culture of his people and of the surrounding peoples. And he's trying to draw them away from that idolatry and that sacrificial violence. And what Cesareo does precisely, and I can't do it here, but that's all we're here to promote his book, is unpack that. With Sheol, the underworld, we have an agreement. That is to say, the place of the dead. When the overwhelming scourge passes through, now we have to remember that in the ancient world, the scourge could be a flood, it could be a famine, these disasters were so powerful, so terrible, they couldn't think of them in human terms. So they thought they must have been brought to them by these powerful divinities who can do them weal or woe, and therefore who must be appeased by sacrifice. And we still, in this day, tend to think of misfortune in social terms. You know, this idea there's something wrong. Well, that's because, well, it's the government. Well, it's the left, it's the right, etc. We tend to seek social explanations, even for natural evils. In any event, they didn't have our science in the ancient world, and this is more or less the viewpoint they have. The scourge was also war, of course, which could devastate, could destroy a community or a city-state or an empire, and also the kind of war which divided members of a community against themselves, and the community would conceivably implode. It would just go into a meltdown, and that the way to avoid this was sacrificial violence. That is to say, you find or invent a scapegoat on whom all the community violence can be exercised. And by the way, that works. It's effective in the sense that if everybody agrees, not in a sort of intellectual way, but if everybody collaborates in the destruction of the scapegoat, you do have collaboration. And competition is surpassed in this collaboration, and peace is restored to the community. And as a result, it's possible to have a culture. You can plant crops. You can divide fields into different legumes, etc. All kinds of things are possible once people stop fighting with one another.
So the lies that are providing the refuge, what can you articulate what those lies are? Is it about the victim? Is it about the violence?
It's about the victim and the violence. That is to say, it's about the idea of violence, which is coming from. It's about the idea of violence, which is sacred, and therefore has to be appeased with the destruction or expulsion of a scapegoat victim. It's about the idea that if we do this, the gods will be kind to us, or at least they won't be out to get us. In the ancient world, in the Greco-Roman world, particularly in the Greek world, the Roman world is much more disillusioned, as Cesareo makes clear in his book on Virgil. There was the sense of the gods could do anything to you, or any time they wanted to, and therefore they had to be appeased regularly. And what Cesareo shows in the Homeric poem is that sacrifice is the hidden secret of all this heroic stuff on the surface of killing and slashing and throttling and stomping, but that, for instance, Achilles occupies that place. Everybody knows, who reads the poem, that Achilles is going to die. Achilles himself knows it. He says, to be a hero, you have to die, rather than say, live old age and tending to your farm. And so he is the placeholder for the god. And Achilles, as Cesareo points out, the representations, images, paintings of Achilles in Greek culture are often the same as the paintings of Apollo. And to add a footnote to that Cesareo doesn't use, but he makes available to understanding, when the scourge, when the plague hits Thebes, the chorus, which are the people, say, this scourge is like a war god. You see, so they regularly confuse natural disaster with supernatural violence. And sacrifice was meant to ward this off. The world was a very terrible, dangerous place. It was out to get them, and it could get them any time.
And the gods were out to get them, which one of these lies, I guess, that of course is central to René's mimetic theory is that the violence of human violence gets what's the term? There's a false transcendence. In other words, the violence is put off humanity onto this transcendent, sacred, and René uses the term sacred in a way like almost synonymous with the violence. He says violence is the heart and secret soul of the sacred. But Cesareo uses sacred slightly differently.
Not slightly differently, emphatically differently. No, because the point of his argument at the beginning of this book, which is really a different turn on mimetic theory, and I think a very important one. It's not easy to talk about in human terms, but that there had to be an experience of the sacred, which was not fallen, which was not violent, for us to even imagine a fallen humanity. And to put it in really simply anthropological terms, if Satan could not have been there at the beginning, you see. If Satan is the murderer and a liar and the father of lies, he couldn't have been there at the very beginning, because if that's true, well, then we're Manichaeist. Well, Satan is the principle of bad, God is the principle of good, and since Satan is always lying to us, and by the way, what the key thing about lies in Isaiah and in Jeremiah as well is not a bald-faced lie. I know the truth, and I'm not going to tell you. It's about self-deception. The way we lie to ourselves, and that we lie to one another. Sociologists have a term, for instance, confirmation bias. There are lots of social science terms for the mechanisms of self-deception, which drive a culture. And I won't go into that critique, but you look around and read the newspapers, and it's really pretty scary, the kinds of things that people believe, because they want to believe them. They need to believe them. I didn't do it. Somebody must have done it. Somebody who's not like me, because I'm a nice guy. So let's find somebody not like me, and point our finger. Raven is very, very effective in making those kinds of things. But that Satan couldn't have been there from the beginning. There must have been, in fact, a Prelapsarian sacred. I'm getting back to my point, actually.
I knew where you were.
I was losing it. No, there must have been a Prelapsarian sacred, in which is let's say, a hypothesis of the book of Genesis. And Cesareo brings forward the writings of Raymond Schwager, who was one of Girard's closest collaborators in Scripture, and who did effect some corrections in René's views about Scripture. Raymond Schwager, the preeminent Roman Catholic theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar, and Gilbert, all three have come together on this Prelapsarian situation.
And Prelapsarian just means
before the fall. If there was a fall, there must have been a fall from something. And it can't have humanity cannot have begun with violent mimesis, because that makes Satan, the father of lies, the father of humanity. You see what I mean? And so there had to be, if there were lies, there had to be a truth. For instance, you cannot posit, you can't talk about lies except in contradiction to truth, you see. So there must have been, in a sense, and again, it's difficult to talk about this because we don't have access to this. There must have been a vision of reality that, for instance, Cesareo talks about very genially when he says that Adam saw this vision of reality, and he saw what God saw. He saw reality through God's eyes. And then as of the fall, we see reality through the other's eyes, through the social other. And by the way, we depend upon that to grow up. But it also means that objective reality is very rarely accessible to us. And I know this as a student of René, that our really greatest novelists are always bringing us back to that. Cervantes, who was a Christian, Proust, who was not, Stendhal, who was not, Dostoevsky, who was not. But that requires a faith in a God who isn't into the business of lying to us. And of course, the Greek gods are lying all over this place. Look what they're doing. They take human form, they rape this one, they abduct that one, etc. Do you see what I mean? There's a chasm between pagan mythology, Greek mythology, and the God of the Hebrews. And I've never read anyone who explores that chasm and fills in, let's say anthropologically, the differences as thoroughly and clearly as Cesareo does in this book.
Yeah. I mean, the case for objectivity is a really important one, that when, it's the foundational insight, of course, of mimetic theory is that we're mimetic, that all contact with any object is mediated. It's always mediated.
Yes.
So if we rivalrous fallen beings, it's bound to have a certain what would you say unreliability about it.
Yes.
Right? So
yeah.
To have true objectivity, you must have a truly, in the words of James Allison, a non-rivalrous mediation.
Exactly.
Right?
Yes. The thing is, mimesis is what makes us human. And there is good mediation and bad mediation. Bad mediation gets us in trouble, deep trouble. It makes us envious, rivalrous, murderous, etc. Good mediation is one which intervenes between us and the world and shows us objects that are good for us to desire and protects us for ones, that are not. The key thing there about objectivity is that the philosophers, for instance, really, I've done a lot of work on this. You held up my book, Philosopher After Philosopher. They've done away with objectivity. Objectivity is a bourgeois myth, we know better than that. And so you have this real nihilism striding through the ranks of philosophy. The scientists believe in objectivity. They couldn't do their work without it. They don't necessarily believe in the God of Abraham, but they're beneficiaries of that faith, that the world is really, truly out there, and that it is ordered, and that it is knowable. It's not a series of illusions and phantasms that can trip us up at any time and knock us over for no good reason.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's where the contrast with the Bible, the biblical literature to the Homeric literature comes in, where the Bible seems just very engaged by the truth and not afraid of it at all.
Yes, and the scriptural passages that Cesareo quotes from the Psalms, that I quote in my review, that they love God's creation. They know it is true because God created it. So there's a link between God's love and God's creation and the truth. That is the bedrock of the faith of Abraham. The faith of Abraham, the father of faith, the father of the three Abrahamic faiths, Israel's, Islam's, and Christianity's. And that, however merely implicit this faith is in today's secularized world, without that bedrock, you don't have a notion of truth that you can trust.
Yeah.
You see, in the philosopher's world, you have your truth and I have my truth, and in a multicultural world, well, it's all very nice to drown, widows because that's what they do in those days or over there, etc. The idea of truth with a capital T is a well, I don't want to use the word heroic, but a heroic conquest, you see, that Israel makes. And that the God of creation is not a God of death. And that, in a sense, the resurrection, you see, is to simply put God's stamp of approval on all the prophetic sayings and all the psalmists who say that the God of Israel is a God of love and who wishes us well and whose law is truth and whose law enables us to live together and doesn't call for any victims at any time.
One of the stories that you bring up pretty frequently is the Akedah of Abraham and Isaac. Can you talk a little bit about how that is getting at the truth in the way that you're talking about it?
Well, it's not a historical truth, perhaps. This may never have happened. However, the way I imagine it, Adam, is this. Israel, the whole Israel at all times, to say it's Exodus, it's not, Israel is not, people think that Israel started the Garden of Eden and all that. We have to remember, we do learn things. There is real scholarship, real knowledge of Scripture, which gives us more information and actually more access to really dazzling truths rather than gratifying our appetite to debunk things. But that the Akedah, the sacrifice of Isaac, which is a scandal, you see. Why would a good God make any of his believers, creatures, do this bad thing? And it's like perhaps the parables, the Good Samaritan may never have happened, but nobody denies the truth of that story. Who, after all, is your neighbor? Is it the guy who walks by or the guy who runs into the ditch to bail you out? These are anthropological truths. These are human, social, scientific evidences. And the way I imagine Israel at this time, because of course Genesis is redacted after, the earliest texts come from the captivity. I'm not going to do that archaeology because I don't know it very well and I'll mess it up. But what's the worst thing our God could do? Okay, our God says, we believe a God who loves us and who made His creation out of love and who wishes us well. What's the worst thing He could do? Well, doesn't take much imagination. He's going to tell me to take my only son, and I'm paraphrasing not too far away, my only son Isaac, whom I love, up to a mountain and kill him. See, now Cesareo is very astute to say that the Bible doesn't get us inside Abraham's head and says, well, what kind of God would want that? Which is our modern secular debunking attitude. Abraham says yes to God because God says, Abraham, here I am. He says, Abraham, Abraham, and Abraham says, here I am. Abraham is, here I am, God. And so he is told to do this, and he goes ahead and does it. And Isaac asks him, well, what will we find the animal for the sacrifice? And he says, well, God will provide us for an animal. It doesn't mean that he knows that he's got a ram hiding in the bush. It doesn't mean that at all. Abraham is not Odysseus. He's not a wise guy. It simply means that he believes in this God to the point where if God tells him to do this, he will go ahead and do it. And because he believes in that God, God intervenes with an angel telling him that you do not slay your son at the very moment of the gutting, and that there is a ram in the bush that you may sacrifice in his place. And so it is a test, but it is not to be seen as a test of Abraham. It's the test that Israel gives itself about its own God and its firm faith, its unrelenting, unswerving faith. And by the way, then of course the Hebrew Bible is mostly about how Israel swerves from that. And the psalmists call them back, and the prophets call them back, and the Moses has to call them back and give them a law and everything else like that. There's a stunning tug of war going on there throughout the Hebrew Bible, and Cesareo gives us a great deal of material with which to re-enter it from an anthropological point of view and an epistemological point of view.
Yeah, one of the quotes that you bring up, biblical quotes that you bring up in your article, is Hosea's quote that God desires mercy and not sacrifice. And this seems to be to flip the archaic sacred on its head.
Yes, quite simply. And by the way, people always say it's Hosea's, but the fact is the mercy not sacrifice is to be found in the Psalms. I think it's 51, etc. Make for me a clean heart. You don't want offerings. And then the psalmist goes on to say, well, if I have a clean heart, now I'm ready to make sacrifices to you. The point of the fact that God wants mercy, not sacrifice, is one of those, and I'm borrowing from the vocabulary of our friend Sandy Goodhart, it's one of those anti-idolatrous statements that if you can make sacrifice to your creator divinity into what the anthropologists call a fetish, into an idol. That is to say, ritual purity. We do the sacrifice exactly as it's set down in the law, in Numbers, in Deuteronomy, etc. So we're in the law, and we're on God's side, and God is on our side. And God, that is to say, the prophets and the psalmists keep coming back and say, no, that is not exactly what your God is about. Ritual purity is something that has to be very, very carefully maintained in pagan cultures because they have no idea whether their God will accept it and whether it will work, because they have no confidence in a God who wishes them well. And in Israel, it is constantly changing its rituals and its sacrifices and pushing its sacrificial envelope, because it intuits that this isn't about a ritual. A ritual is a way of performing our love and fealty and gratitude for God. but let's not make it into an idol. And that is always a danger. And listen, I'm a Roman Catholic. I know all about, making an idolatry of hierarchy, clergy, and ritual.
Making a ritual into an idol. Yeah. One of the things that was going through my mind when you guys were talking earlier was when Jesus says that, or at least somewhere in the gospel it says that Satan was a murderer from the beginning. And so the question becomes, well, what at the beginning of what? So here I think you get into the beginning of culture, right? So at the point of hominization, you have this sense of the benevolence of the world, that God is love and that the world is for you. But then where I think Girard comes in, the post-Prelapsarian fall is where human culture comes in, which you see with the story of Cain and Abel. And another very interesting comparison and contrast is one that Suzanne has done frequently, contrasting Cain and Abel with Romulus and Remus myth. And I'm wondering if either you, Andrew, or Suzanne want to comment on Satan being a murderer from the beginning of human culture.
Well, I mean, that's a question I wanted you to talk about, was that Cesareo says that he's differing with Renee on this point, that the arbitrariness of the victim or the founding murder was not unknown to pagan science. In other words, he says that pagan science understood that the victim mechanism was a foundational mechanism.
Well, they understood.
Yeah.
The pagans know. They're great. Sophocles, Aeschylus, Euripides, to use Cesareo's phrase, Virgil, they knew. But they had to sort of go along with the cover-up, you see. I mean, the people knew what their priests and their rulers told them. People need to believe things. We are these language-using animals, and we tell people stories, and we tell stories most about what goes on in the world and what we think is true. And, by the way, we are also the storytelling animal. Narrative and truth and experience are hopefully bound up with each other. And by the way, that to me, in a sense, is the quote-unquote miracle, or take off the scare quotes, of the Hebrew Bible. The truth and narrative are of a piece. These are all stories about a people, about a man, about a prophet, about a king, etc. That the human reality is narrative, because we live in space and time and we move through time.
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say the Romulus and Remus myth is describing not just the origin of the city, but the origin of a god, or the story of a god who kills his brother, but is divinized.
Yes. Where
in the Cain and Abel story, of course, we have God being distanced from the violence in a way that you don't have in the ancient world.
Yeah, I mean, it's really paradigmatic. In the Romulus and Remus story, Remus is told not to jump over a wall that Romulus has built, and he does, and his brother kills him. And he does this, and he founds Rome. That is to say, he kills his brother with God's approval, and he is the founder of Rome. And it was, I remember coming across the text in Livy, which ad urbe candita, of the 700 years ago, the founding of Rome, from the time of Livy in the beginning of the empire, where in fact Livy says that Romulus, at the end of his life, went up to the Capitoline Hill, and he was zoomed into heaven, and it became a god. And see, Livy is Roman. He's late. He's a late comer to these myths, and he says, of course, some people say he went into the Senate and they tore him to pieces. And of course, the anthropologists say, which story do you believe is true? And of course, we'll say they probably tore him to pieces. Michel Serres has a whole book called Rome, the Book of Foundations, just developing and waxing on that mythology. Whereas the Cain and Abel story, you have Cain, the founder of cities, who murders his brother without God's approval, and in very explicit terms. The blood of your brother cries out from the ground. And so it is very good anthropology. You get Doubts in Livy, who is writing in somewhat clandestine circumstances. He's got to be very careful. Whereas the Cain and Abel story blows the whistle on the origins of culture in murder. And whether that happened or not, you see, it's very much like the Akeda. It's true. It tells a true story of rival brothers, both of whom want to be pleasing to their created divinity, and one of whom is jealous of the other. So what becomes the lie? Rivalry, envy, etc. And why? Because he's turned his God, you see, into some sort of unforgiving or violent divinity. You see, yeah.
Well, and the rest of lies against, of course, then the Cain and Abel story leads to stories about vengeance and violence multiplying, and Cain needing to be protected from cycles of revenge and so forth. And so that's the sacrificial order. Actually, I think we tend to look down on the pagan sacrificial world and forget how effective it actually was. It was their only, Cesareo says, their only protection against the scourge of violence. It was what it was what worked for them, and they weren't going to back away from it without something else.
Right. And they had nothing else.
Yeah.
Now, here again, I want to plug another of Cesareo's book, The Humble Life of Don Quixote, subtitles about faith and fiction, I believe, where he makes it clear that the great writers of antiquity, Sophocles, Euripides, Virgil, they knew, but they pulled back from what they knew. They couldn't advertise because they had no hope. They had no hope because they didn't have a God who loved them and wished well for them, who created them, and who looked out for them and told them to look out for one another. That is to say, the widow, the orphan, the stranger, etc. And so, whereas Israel is constantly pushing, let's say, the interpretive hermeneutic envelope of its divinity, this family feud is going on all the time between God and his creatures. God says to Abraham, "I'm going to take out that town." He says, "No." He said, "What if there's 100?" And we know that story. It's a beautiful story. Right. It's the flip side of any sacrificial approach to human violence and to warfare. Well, we have to take that town, destroy its inhabitants in order to increase our empire. And how many good people does Abraham get, for God to forgive the whole city? Is it 10? It doesn't matter. Did that dialogue take place in human history? Well, it could have, I suppose, because, after all, it's God. He can talk to anybody he pleases. But in any event, it's a true story. It's a true story in the sense that it talks about the God of Israel is unlike all the other gods, and who is involved with humanity, because Abraham talks back to him, And our friend Sandy Goodhart could be very funny about these things, because he's my rabbi, so he tells it, sometimes these things with, like a Jewish joke. There are lots of Jewish jokes in the Hebrew Bible, which are not, say Bronx, Brooklyn versions, but that there is an opening for hope and expressiveness that is unique to that volume, because it isn't preoccupied by its glorious, shimmering, heroic surface. You see, that's
which is
difference.
Afraid of knowing too much, afraid of what you might find out.
Well, this is another fact that he brings out about the ancient religions. They were all religions of secrecy. Their rituals were secret. They were not to be divulged. And the Hebrew Bible is always pushing against the notions of secrecy, because, after all, idolatry is all about secrecy. You mean that golden calf is actually, some divinity, etc.? Well, if everybody believes it, they'll sacrifice to it, and they won't tear each other to pieces. Right. But finally, those idolatries are given over to what St. Paul calls the powers and the principalities. That's the God of empires. Mm-hmm. And of the earthly city, the city of man, mm-hmm. which is sustained by a sacrificial mentality. And frankly, if you look at the world today, it's not really, or I was going to say it's not much different. It's not different at all. Mm-hmm. We need enemies, and we define ourselves over mm-hmm. against our enemies, internal mm-hmm. and external, mm-hmm. and people are at peace with that. But that's the peace that is satanic. It's not the peace that surpasses understanding. Right. Because that peace, somehow or other, seems to be able to be realized when you give your life for your friend or your neighbor, rather than spending your best energies trying to take his life and his goods. Let me follow that up with something that I'm mindful of, Adam, from a previous conversation. And I'm not sure if it comes clear in this context, but you remember we were talking about Cesareo says that Adam saw what before the fall. Adam saw what God saw because he sees things through God. And then something reminded me of the story of Jacob and Esau. Family feud, rivalry, etc., Cain and Abel, but it doesn't go south because Jacob comes back to his brother. Jacob, by the way, his cognomen is the usurper, the guy who takes his brother's place. That is to say, he's the Remus or the Romulus or the Cain. And he's reconciled to his brother. You don't find reconciliation typically in pagan myth. It's about swoons of violence and then divine interventions which were appeased to put an end to it. And you told me, you cited the verse in Genesis, or maybe it was from the Quran, when Jacob says, when he looks at his brother, I think I see the face of God. Mm-hmm. Is that how it goes? Recall that, Adam? Yeah.
It's, well, I'm reminded. I think it's what? Genesis 38, where, Jacob receives the forgiveness from Esau, and he says that in you I see the face of God. Yeah.
Jacob says that.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah.
You see? You know what? After that conversation, something else occurred to me, and I'll risk it because I'm not an exegete of the gospel. But remember the martyrdom of Stephen. Just before the stones pile up on him, mm-hmm. He says, I see the heavens open. Now give me the rest of that quote. Yeah. Because that's also, in a sense, that's continuous. I mean, it's Jacob's vision of his brother. It's a vision of God. It's continuous with the kind of vision that Cesareo hypothesizes for Adam and Eve before the fall. And I'm wondering whether, in fact, that's also precisely what we now call Saint Stephen says, mm-hmm. When he says, I see the heavens, go ahead, give me the line, thank you. I see the heavens opened and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God, you see, which means he sees the face of God, and he sees the Son of Man, which you see in a sense, and I would like to ask some, biblical expert, he sees what Adam sees. He sees God created, he sees man is God's creation, and he sees this the Son of Man, which is Jesus, and he makes a point which is so obvious and so simple that never occurred to anybody. God is mimetic. God is mimetic. He made us in his image, and to top that, he sent us his Son as himself. Okay, he incarnated himself, and we have a hard time making it. Well, Jesus is the Son of God, and Jesus is God. But that is a mimetic activity, and it reminds us that all of Hebrew Scripture, as well as the New Testament, we call the Christian Bible, which ratifies Hebrew Scripture, it doesn't add anything really terribly important in my view. Now, I'm instructed by Rabbi Goodhart about that, but he's very convincing. That the truth and the narrative, that's not where I was going, Suzanne. What was my hobby horse in that particular moment?
Just the connection between the garden and Stephen's vision and Jacob's vision of God, and we're seeing the truth
Yes.
through God's eyes. I think.
Yes. Well, that's as far as I got.
I didn't know where else you were going. That's as far as I got too.
But you see the thing now. You have to excuse me, but the fact is, again, Cesareo's book opens up so much scripture. You can see connections or relations that he doesn't even make explicit. You know, in my review, I talk about Gethsemane and the Acacia together. He doesn't make that connection.
Right.
But he reads the agony in the garden in a way that makes it really, I think, powerfully obvious that the agony in the garden is a flip of the sacrifice of Isaac.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, especially when you made that reference to the angels ministering to Jesus and
interrupting the murder. You know, what are those angels doing there? The angel of God is is God's messenger, etc.
Yeah.
It's a placeholder, if you will, for for the God. And of course, Jesus is heading towards a lynching, and it is not a sacrifice that his God could anyway have willed, etc. What is very clear that his God wants his people, his creatures, to know that he is not a God of sacrifice, and that's why you have the "Thy will be done," fiat voluntas tua, out of Jesus' mouth, which echoes the incarnation. Those are the same words. That's not an accident. Where Mary says, "Let it be done according to your word," fiat secundum verbum tuum, and the famous creation fiat that everybody knows and everybody doesn't believe in about God said, "Let there be light." There is truth in that, but it is a truth that is based on faith. I mean, you can't prove that's how the world came into existence or the universe or any of those things. René likes to remind us the theory of the Big Bang was discovered by a Belgian priest, however. There is no antithesis between big science and religious faith. That is a piece of hokum thought up by some sort of post-Enlightenment professors who just made an idol, really, of science.
Good. We have a couple of other comments and questions in the chat room. Suella brings up another moment when the heavens opened up, not the stoning, but Noah and the flood story, where God sends the flood. That story is in pop culture these days with the film out. And Suella also points out that it is in the reading from the Epistle of 1 Peter this week. So she wants to know what we might make of the Noah story that points to God's violence.
Well, I remember. Yeah, well, my thought on this is that the various translations of that story, the typical one said, well, the earth was filled with evil, and so God decided he would destroy it. But one of the translations, the earth was filled with violence, which makes the flood a placeholder for this cultural meltdown, where everybody is fighting with everybody else. And culture will not survive. And we see in today's headlines, cultures do not survive. Some of them are on the brink, of self-extinction through their quadrupart civil wars and terrorisms and everything else like that. Some of them are just barely being propped up by, frankly, Western wealth. And the Noah story is obviously a story of total annihilation of the creation, and it is attributed to the Creator God. On the other hand, this is the Bible which is working out its relationship to real disaster, human or natural. Its relationship, on the one hand, to real disaster, human, natural, on earth that they inhabit, to the God they believe in. And the Noah story is sort of midway between, let's say, the mythical and the anthropological in that regard. But it ends with the olive branch, right? I.e., the first sign of land, the first sign of the new creation, is the ark, right? The arc-en-ciel, we call it, the rainbow. And the sign of terrestrial contiguity is the olive branch in the dove's beak, if I remember.
Right.
So that's one of those stories which brings together a mythical God, probably Mesopotamian, by the way. We know that the Hebrews didn't sit around making this stuff up, but it challenges it at the same time.
Yeah, it does.
Yes.
Well, because, and again, I know I've probably read this in James, I don't know where else, in James Allison, but that flood story, of course, we're getting the story, it's like the stoning of Achan. In that story, the crowd tells the story, and Achan and his family are all killed, and we never hear from them again, right? In the flood story, there is this flood of violence, but whose story are we getting? It's like we're getting the family, maybe they're the victims that got away or something, and we're getting their story. And I don't know if when I escape a near-death experience, I kind of think God was on my side.
Well,
you know what I mean? It's a natural thing to say. I don't know.
And a very dangerous thing to say.
And dangerous, exactly.
Because to the extent only that, he's on my side, by the way, and not yours.
That's
right. But back to that, and we're just conjecturing here. But the earth was filled with evil, or the earth was filled with violence. And God destroys the earth. He destroys except for Noah. Why does he save Noah? Because Noah is like Abraham.
Yeah.
Noah is faithful to his God. So you have faith in the goodness of this God and in His law, and obey His law, you will survive. But obviously, if you going about with these murderous sacrifices, two possibilities: your culture will self-destruct, or in the ancient world, the more plausible one, God will send down His wrath and flood it. But again, the flood and the plague are two constants in all mythologies for cultural meltdown, for cultural maelstroms, for internecine violence, which is never acknowledged as such because it is so terrible you can't believe it's happening.
Exactly. And that's why I think it leads us to Cesareo's point that it's not knowledge that saves, but love. I mean, when you're saying the faith of Abraham and the faith of Noah, they believed in a God they could trust, but that God had to somehow make Himself known as trustworthy.
But not only trustworthy, you see, that's a very strong corrective that Cesareo brings to mimetic theory, as expressed by René Girard. He says it couldn't have been, when he talks about misrecognition, they misunderstood their own violence for divine violence, and so they sacralized violence and made an idol, etc. And I won't go back all the way through that argument, but go to that passage precisely in his book where he says, listen, the triumph of the cross isn't epistemological, it's not cognitive. I.e., now you know, because this was just a lynching and not some divinely sponsored sacrifice. It's not cognitive, it's personal. Jesus is a person. And the confidence that Abraham has in the Father and that Jesus has in the Father, it's not cognitive. I believe you because you have a PhD or because you have more property or more prestige than I do. It's not born of a confidence. It's not cognitive. It's love, you see. The faith of Abraham is based on love, rooted in love. The faith of Jesus also. This past, all the John's Gospel, all the teachers, all the Hebrew Scriptures, and the Christian Scriptures. God is love, loving kindness, loving mercy, etc., forgiving all again and again and again. That's an important point because there's too much emphasis, let's say, on the scientific dimension of mimetic theory, which is true. But Cesareo argues persuasively that truth has, let's say, a bedrock of faith. And it's the faith that got us there, and that faith, again, is not an epistemological exercise. The faith is based on love. And, I mean, so it brings love together with truth in a way that makes more anthropological sense than it ever did before for me.
Right.
You see.
Absolutely.
There are two comments that I want to get to. One is from Lindsay, And Andrew, I think you're going to resonate with this. I'm going to try to put her comment in a bit of a nutshell, but she's thinking that maybe we should, about the idea of the fall, we should get rid of it altogether and instead believe that we are made to evolve or rise to Jesus, who is the first human being. Is it necessary to think of a prelapsarian human condition, or can we believe that we are still being made in the image of the God of love, still becoming human? And I know that you've had issues with the prelapsarian argument and whether it matters or doesn't matter. So I'm wondering if you want to comment on Lindsay's question.
Well, it does matter. It matters to me more when I go back over it and spend more time with it than I did initially. I don't speak about it in my book review because, frankly, I knew that I couldn't really get my mind around it within the time and space that I was given to write the review. But there is that idea, of course, in Christian theology, Orthodox theology, that Jesus is the most complete man. He's the fullest man. And that harmonization, which theology is not very preoccupied with, but there are overlaps between anthropology and theology in this, that harmonization is an ongoing project. I don't have much to say about that, because I haven't given it much thought. I'm skeptical of these Teilhard de Chardin type of ideas that all that rises must converge and that we're all heading towards an omega point. Frankly, it sounds mythological to me. I think we have to take a much more careful and thoughtful look about the prelapsarian condition of the human, consider it, reconsider it, and reconnect it to mimetic anthropology. That's as far as I can go. And by the way, I think that is a very big project, and and Cesareo has put it on the table.
Yes.
And we all need to work on it. So I cannot answer that question. But yes, it is a very important question. It's a very important way of raising that question.
Mm-hmm.
Good.
I agree with the question.
Yes.
Yeah. Lisa says that she reads the Sodom and Gomorrah story in a similar way that you were talking about a previous story, that the culture destroys itself when the scapegoats are no longer available. So that's just an instance of another biblical story to support what you were saying earlier. Our last comment question is from Tim, and he asks this: would you recommend Bandera's book for people unfamiliar with Girard? What is the intended audience?
Well, that's a very good question.
Yeah.
And the answer is no, perhaps. What I mean is that the previous book, The Humble Life of Don Quixote, walks us back through mimetic desire, how our desires copy each other, and how that can lead to cooperation or to competition, and how competition can lead to death. And destruction, including self-destruction. And as I say in my review, this is a very compact book, but it doesn't give us the rudiments, if you will. Perhaps it takes them for granted, but one can go to Raven, one can go to Imitatio, to those sites and get a self-instructional vocabulary, if you will, to prepare yourself for that. It is, on the other hand, it's a book I think that biblical exegetes should pay careful attention to, for the way it reads Scripture, for the way it reads the Hebrew Bible, of which it has much more to say, than the Christian Bible, and therefore it's a very important book, regardless of the fact that it doesn't, let's say, walk us into mimetic theory as carefully as we're accustomed to, or that we may demand.
Yeah, you mentioned Gil Bailey earlier in the session. I would suggest his book, Violence Unveiled, as a better way to get into this way of reading the text. And then, Cesareo is like stepping into the middle of a conversation with this book.
Yes, in fact, that's exactly what happens, because he talks about violence and the sacred. That's when he met Renee.
Yes.
And of course he read back Deceit, Desire, and the novel, these other things. But his conversation and his controversy, because there's real disagreement with mimetic theory as it stands in Renee's own terms at times. At times, he even says, well, I know Renee knows this, but he's sort of giving us the impression of something the opposite. Yes, certainly Gil Bailey's book. Or the one, let's say, pedagogical tool that I often recommend is, if there's one book you're going to read by Renee, or the first book, rather, because you have to read them all, they're important, and they're true, would be the I See Satan's Soul Like Lightning. There, Renee walks us back through, and he walks us through contemporary history and pagan mythology and all
yes,
that.
that's excellent.
Yeah.
You are getting a big yes from Lisa Hadler right now on that one in the chat room. JC says, yup. Lisa also throws out Jim Warren's book, Compassion or Apocalypse, which is also great. We interviewed Jim a while back, and we'll be reposting that up. I'm also going to throw out The Wicked Truth by our very own Suzanne Ross, because that is another brilliant introduction to mimetic theory using pop culture. So yeah, Tim, I hope that's enough introductions to mimetic theory for you. Great, thumbs up all around. Thank you, Lisa. And we've come to the end. Go ahead, Andrew.
Haven't even done that work for your audience, so we're taking a lot for granted. I so much like Jim Warren's book, I put a blurb on Amazon because I want to encourage people, to read this. Then, of course, I reviewed Suzanne's book, and I agree with you. These are two very good entry-level work to start with. Well,
and so we be all-inclusive here. Our good friend Wolfgang Palaver also wrote a great introduction. So we need to throw that one in there. So probably missing creating some mimetic envy and rivalry up here, but that's what you do. So, all right. Well, Andrew, thank you so much again for being with us. Great conversation. And we are just so grateful for your friendship and your love and your knowledge. So thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you. I'm grateful for the opportunity to find out what it is I think. We only know what we think when we hear what we say.
Ain't it the truth?
That's because we're mimetics.
That's right.
Well, there you go. I love it. And thank you, everybody, for being with us. We will post this in the next few days and send out a link on our Teaching Nonviolent Atonement Facebook page. So keep checking up on that, and we'll post it up there. So until next time, peace be with you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.